Hello humans, I'm Johannes from Donkong, and it's been a while. We've been kind of busy releasing music, for example like Snakebite on Hexagon. But I'm back now, and today I would like to talk about Reverb. Which one is the best? How do I use it? And why did I cut my hair? All these questions will be answered in this video. Let's go. So there are many types of reverbs, right? You have the hall reverb, the chamber reverb, the ambience reverb, the spring reverb, the plate reverb, the gated reverb, the reverse reverb. Many different kinds of reverbs, and same, you have all these kinds of different plugins from all these different brands trying to emulate these reverbs. So which plugin do I actually need? And how can I choose between all of these different plugins which one is right for me? There are two types of plugins on the market right now. Convolution reverb plugins and algorithmic digital reverb plugins. Now, when I started making music, people used to tell me, use convolution, because convolution plugins are probably the most realistic sounding plugins. So why is that? What is convolution anyway? Now, what these plugins do, they actually use impulse responses from real rooms, halls, whatever. So what are impulse responses? You get that by actually going into a room, placing a mic there, making a loud noise, and recording that. You also need a safety vest just to make sure. You then feed the impulse response into your plugin and it simulates the room that you recorded. This is actually the reason why in convolution plugins, for example like Space Designer and Logic, you can actually choose between real rooms that really exist, like an opera house, a church, a cathedral, or even the German Hansa studios. So if you want to sound as realistic and organic as possible, use these reverbs. Problem is they are kind of expensive and they are more CPU heavy, so you have to use them wisely in your project. On the other hand, we have the algorithmic plugins. They just simulate a room. They don't use these impulse responses or anything like it. It's just math in general, and the math generates your room and your reverb. Now, these do sound more digital, of course, and less real. But I think times have changed, because when people told me to use these convolution reverbs, that was like 10 years ago, at that time most algorithmic reverbs sounded cold. They weren't nearly as realistic as these days. But I think that has changed. These days algorithmic reverbs sound way warmer than they used to and way more realistic. In EDM you don't really need that organic sound. I think one of the few exceptions is maybe vocals, because in most EDM tracks, your only organic signal is the vocal, and so it kind of makes sense to maybe use a convolution reverb on that to make it sound as realistic and real and nice as possible. But in my experience, in EDM, you don't need convolution. It's just too much CPU, too much money, and yeah, algorithmic is way more easier and way more fun. But how do you choose between all these algorithmic plugins? Now, I don't have a big guide for you there. All I can tell you is how I chose my favorite plugin there. And that's, if you saw us on Twitch, you probably know it already because I put it on everything. That's actually Valhalla Room. This is actually my favorite reverb plugin. And why did I choose it? I chose this plugin because you just open it up and it instantly sounds good. I realized you can tweak it so easily, because I think many of these reverbs, they have so many parameters. Also Valhalla has all these parameters, and they look pretty complicated. When I'm like in my workflow, I don't want to tweak around for days. I just want to have like 2 or 3 parameters that I know what they do and just make things work. Valhalla lets me do that. Valhalla sounds good when it's a small room, but also when it's a big room. And This is something that most reverbs can't do, in my opinion. Mostly you find one good plugin for a small room and one good plugin for a big room. To my taste, Valhalla can do both. And lastly, to me, it feels like Valhalla doesn't use any CPU, kind of. I mean, I almost put it as an insert on almost any channel in my projects. It's simple, it works, the user interface is simple, it's plain, but it's okay, you can work with it. So this is how I chose mine. I just chose the plugin that sounded good to me and that was versatile, that I can kind of use for different styles of reverb, and that's fun to play around with. Now, what can I actually do with reverb? Because I think in general, reverb is there to create some kind of, in Germany we say Tiefenstaffelung, and I just found a translation on Google, depth graduation. I don't know if that makes sense. Bring some dimension to your track, to put one element behind the other, to put stuff in the background, just to move things away from the listener. One of my favorite techniques is actually making elements leave the room. Increase the reverb so it kind of moves away from you, and at the same time, as in real life, you just put on an EQ with a high cut or high shelf that just takes out all the high frequencies. It kind of feels like your element is moving away from you into a different room or whatever, just leaving. Then of course, reverb can also mask things. Like you can see that on singers. You can take a pretty shitty singer and he will definitely sound better with reverb. I never thought that I would end up here. I never thought that I would end up here. But for real, I think in our music especially, reverb is mostly used for sound design, for making things sound more interesting. And how can you make reverb sound interesting? Well, automate the mix, automate the size, or just automate everything. Now, one of the most mistakes I hear in demos that people send us is too much reverb. And my answer to that is always try to focus on the elements that are important. And these probably don't need that much reverb as the elements that should be more in the background. Don't just listen on headphones, because in my opinion, it's really hard to judge reverb only on headphones. And probably one of the most common things is cut out the mids, or even everything below, I don't know, 500 Hertz of your reverb. There are lots of reverbs like Pro R that already have that kind of function included in the plugin. To end this video, let's talk about my favorite reverb techniques. Number one, do small reverbs. I think especially in EDM, people use big hall played reverbs so much. Everything is so big and so epic, especially vocals. What artists like Billie Eilish, for example, taught us is that small reverbs can be really interesting and intimate. Think outside of the box. If you have an element that's usually in a really big room, try putting it in a really small room. Look what happens. Second, compress your reverb. That's actually something I mostly do on accident because I build my processing chain and then there's some kind of OTT after my reverb after a while and I didn't even realize it. I think this is really powerful to make your reverb sound even more sound designish and crazy if you compress it with, for example, OTT, and get even more control over your mix. Make stuff dry on purpose. Most music is pretty wet, right? Because we want to create some kind of room for the elements. We want to make it sound human and kind of warm to us. And that's why I think it's really interesting to take elements that are maybe really wet and make them dry just for a second. Make your whole track dry for just one small chop. That's what we really like to do. And I think the effect you kind of get, like the whole song just jumps to you, jumps right into your ears, maybe really fast, maybe really slow during your build-up. I think you can kind of play around with that, with the whole contrast between dry and wet. So guys, this was more of a talking video and less hands-on. Let me know if you like this kind of video, because this was actually fun to do and to prepare, because I could actually just talk about things I think about anyway, almost, not every day maybe, but when I do music. So yeah, let me know how you like it and see you next time.
Please don't kill me.